Welcome to Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to be having, and we are having, about the state of democracy in the Americas. My name is Eric Farnsworth, coming to you again from Washington, but this time in front of a live audience, which is the Council of the Americas Young Professionals of the Americas audience. This is a year of elections from Mexico to the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Panama, Uruguay, and Venezuela, and even here in the United States. U.S. elections in November will not just impact this country, but the rest of the hemisphere, and indeed, the world. Already there have been dramatic fits and starts in the process. Some are calling these elections unprecedented, and indeed they may be. The question is, where are we? And where are we going? What are the primary issues driving the campaigns? And what are the most relevant political scenarios? And frankly, what does all of this mean for the Americas, including migration, trade, security, and democracy? We're very pleased to have as our guest today Franco Ordoñez, the White House correspondent for NPR's Washington desk, where he focuses primarily on immigration and foreign affairs, but other things as well. Franco has traveled across the world covering U.S. Presidents Trump and Biden. Apart from his White House assignments, he's also reported from Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Haiti, and just for good measure, Ukraine. Among others, this election year, he's also covering the 2024 campaign. I've had the privilege of speaking with him both on and off the record over the years, including from his years before NPR, when he covered diplomatic affairs for McClatchy. Franco Ordoñez, welcome to Democracy Dialogues.
It is great to be here. We have had a long history of working together, so it's great to be here. It's great to be back at the Council of Americas.
Well, we're very honored to have you with us. You've covered elections around the world, literally, primarily in the Western Hemisphere. Give us a sense of, as an observer, what are you seeing in the U.S. elections right now? Where are we, and what are some of your initial impressions?
Wow. I mean, it has been quite the whirlwind of the last few weeks. I mean, you have, a debate where, the last few weeks you had a debate where the President of the United States raised a lot of questions about his health and his mental acuity. Next week, the former president, who is also the Republican nominee, gets shot in the ear. You have a Republican National Convention where it seems like the Republican momentum just surges. And then a week later, less than a week later, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, decides that he is not going to run for office. Now you have a new likely nominee at this point. Kamala Harris, the vice president, has gained some momentum, and there's a lot of attention on her, a lot of focus on her. It is going to be a very interesting next 4 months. What will come out of this, I am not really sure yet, but I do know that it'll be very exciting.
With all of these changes, what are some of the drivers that you see in terms of, what are the issues, but also the politics behind this? I mean, what are you as a journalist covering the White House, what are you focusing on? What are you choosing to focus on?
I mean, so right now I'm focusing a lot on the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
I have long had my feet in Biden world, but once Trump emerged, I've kind of had my feet in both worlds. In the last couple of weeks, it's been largely in Trump world, or more so in Trump world. So I've been kind of watching his momentum rise and rise, especially after that debate that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Now, right now, I'm watching very much the reaction of Trump world to Harris. After he was shot, there was a lot of talk about whether that shooting was going to humanize. I had a lot of sources tell me that that kind of experience really changes a person, and he was changed. And during the convention, he was, you could argue he's more personal. He talked a little bit more about faith. But since then, and even in that speech as well that he gave during the convention, he's kind of shifted back to some of the more stronger the stronger language that he's kind of known for. So right now, I'm watching to see, does he continue kind of that path? Because even in the most recent days and most recent campaigns, he has really attacked Harris in a way that has been extremely harsh. And he's been so strong about Biden. I'm very interested to hear how he connects her to Biden. But also, as we know, and as you guys know, he has a challenging relationship with women in power, with race, and I'm very curious about how that will play out over the next couple.
I mean, that's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. But you pointed to the change from the Democratic Party, and we have to say the presumptive candidate for the Democratic Party. But assuming it is Kamala Harris, and that has fundamentally changed. If you're looking at the conversation from Trump world, how they must be looking at the campaign. No, because they're obviously the candidate, their opponent has changed, but also the issues, the generation, some of the energy issues. And I'm not talking about oil and gas, I'm talking about personal energy. Talk to us a little bit about that. How has that changed in the dynamic of the race?
For sure. I mean, for so long, Trump was painting Biden as a very old, unable to walk, couldn't string two sentences together. On the campaign trail, in rallies, he would make motions, gestures to make fun of Biden. He can't do that with Kamala Harris, who is, decades younger than him, a couple decades. So he does have to kind of change in that sense in personality. On the issues, he will argue, and his campaign will argue, that they're one and the same. That the
Biden
issues
and Harris are one
that
and the
Biden
same.
and Harris are one and the same, and their strategy is very much that they have the same issues, that they have the same policies, and there's a reason for that, is because they've spent so much resources on Biden, attacking Biden's policies, blaming him for rising inflation, blaming him for immigration issues. And the immigration issue is another issue that, as we've heard in recent weeks, they've really latched onto because of Harris's involvement in migration and being named to address the root causes of migration.
We're going to come to this issue in a bit, but from a political perspective, it sounds like you think that perhaps migration is a political vulnerability for Harris if she's the nominee.
I think at this point it definitely is, and I think the Democrats recognize that as well. By Trump, Trump has already, and his campaign and the Republican supporters are trying to tag her with this border czar name.
Right.
As this group knows, as you know, that's not really the case. She was tasked with working in diplomacy with Central American and Latin American governments. Certainly there is a migration component to that, but she was never tasked with identifying, or fixing the border per se. But that doesn't necessarily matter in politics. It's about messaging. It's about what lanes you can put in and how do you paint a certain politician. And she has struggled from the beginning with that issue. I mean, even when Biden, kind of appointed her or tasked her with this job, this has been something that she has struggled with, and for sure, it's going to be an issue that she's going to have to face.
As I've called that particular issue many times over the years, I've called it intractable, and it's defeated a lot of people in terms of that have tried to look at it.
Biden had that same position. I mean, as you know, billions and billions of dollars have been spent on trying to address the root causes of migration. Border issues continue to be a problem. Trying to change that is something I don't know how to fix. As one Republican specialist once told me, it's a big problem when the United States government wants to fix the problem more than perhaps the governments in those countries.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Let's change the lens a little bit. So if the candidate from the Democratic Party has changed, what does that mean in terms of Trump? In other words, would Harris have some new lines of attack with Trump that would not work if Biden were the candidate? Let's look at it from the opposite side.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see some of that. It is very in the early stages. At this point, much of the language is kind of continuing kind of the attacks that Biden has done that Trump is a threat to democracy, that he's looking to totally overhaul the government. She has pointed to Project 2025, which is the very controversial plan put together by the Heritage Foundation. Trump, of course, denies any connection to it, but the reality is the people that are part of Heritage Foundation or part of Project 2025 are very intertwined with Trump world. And the reality is very likely to be components of a second administration if there is a second Trump administration. Harris has also been attacking Trump on debates, wanting to get him to debate her in the same format that Biden has. There's, at the moment, questions about whether ABC will be the next debate. And that's a sensitive issue because Trump is trying to put it into more familiar or friendly territory. And Harris is trying to kind of push him to do it. And we will see a much different debate. I think there's no question about that. Yeah. Biden's debate was bad in many ways. Harris, younger, she's former prosecutor. I think we would see a much different approach.
It's going to be tremendously different from the first one, I would imagine, to the second one. Let's move on from the campaign to how they might govern. And again, I get it. All this is speculative. We can't know the answer, so we're just talking in terms of we're trying to draw, a picture from strings and
as a journalist, it's very hard. I don't like to speculate, but
I get it, and that's fair. So I'm going to ask you an unfair question, right?
Go for it.
Let's say that President Trump were reelected. What would you anticipate would be some of the things he would choose to prioritize were he president of the United States again? And then I'll ask the same question with Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't have to speculate too much there. I mean, I think especially for this group, when looking at Latin America, migration is going to be a huge issue. Yeah. It was a huge issue of his first campaign. It was a huge issue of his first administration. It is, again, a huge issue of this campaign, and you can expect it will be a huge issue of a second administration if you were to get it.
Let me, and I was going to do this later in the discussion, but let's do it now because you've raised the issue, and I think it's a fundamental point that we need to talk about. When you say it's a huge issue, what does that mean in the migration context if Donald Trump were president the second time?
What I mean is that would be a very significant focus for Trump, but also kind of like the centerpiece, the glue, or the thing that ties the rest of Latin America policy together. I think it really is going to be at the core of policy with Latin America.
You would suggest perhaps that it would be a more restrictionist policy?
Yes, for sure. I think Trump has made very clear with some of his promises, mass deportations, even just very recently he had an interview with Fox saying that bombing this question about whether he would bomb cartels, something like that would be on the table if Mexico doesn't take more action. These are all related to the migration issue, which of course is related to the fentanyl issue and resurgence or entry of fentanyl into working class communities. So there's no doubt that what he wants to do on the most basic terms is curb the number of migrants who are coming to the United States, and likely do that in very hard line ways, pushing governments, Latin American governments, Central American governments, my way or not. Are you with us or not? And I think we can safely expect that will be an extreme push from him. And that's what, when I speak to people who are close to, the Trump administration before and who are very involved in this issue, expect as well.
No, that's good insights. It's interesting hearing you talk. These issues are real. And they do vex the United States. There's no doubt about that. But sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. I mean, you got to make sure that you're not doing harm if you're trying to address an issue. I wonder, and let's take it out of the politics and put it in the economics. I mean, the United States economy requires workers to grow. And in fact, in the Republican convention, Doug Burgum, who was being considered, at least for a while, as a vice presidential candidate, was complaining that in North Dakota, it's difficult to get qualified workers.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue not only in North Dakota, it's
Yeah.
an issue in Florida, issue in North Carolina. It's an issue in a lot of these states. And it's, something that you would anticipate that, the trade organizations that represent the farming community, agriculture community would immediately address. I mean, a lot of this is politics,
Yeah,
as
sure.
we know.
Yeah.
And a lot of the language about mass deportations is politics. Another reality is, and you know this better than anywhere else, is that the U.S. government does not have the resources to accomplish, to do what to fulfill the promises that Trump is making. He has kind of backed off when pressed on that they're going to focus on, dangerous individuals at first. But, I mean, just the threat of that is having big impacts. I mean, and if it was possible, I was talking with some analysts this week who are saying, how it could impact those Latin American governments if they had to absorb all these people into their communities. They're struggling enough with their economies. How are they going to fit into their labor force? Not to mention remittances, how that would impact. And remittances, how is, as you know, maybe a way that less people end up coming to the United States. I mean, it's a circular issue.
It is a circular issue. We're talking Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, countries like Haiti, et cetera. We're here with Franco Ordoñez, who is the White House correspondent on the Washington desk with National Public Radio, NPR, talking about the U.S. elections and how it impacts or could impact relations with the Western Hemisphere. Let's talk about Kamala Harris, again, the presumptive candidate, not yet the formal candidate of the Democratic Party, but assuming that she is, I ask the same question. How would she govern? Do you anticipate what would be some of her priorities as President of the United States, the first woman president? Would that make a difference? Or is this just a straightforward thing? We're post-worrying about all that sort of stuff and we're moving on. I imagine the answer is there's something there.
I think there's absolutely something there. I'm a little more sensitive or a little more, Trump has a history. He has a background that we can point to. With her, it's a little bit more difficult to speculate. But when I speak to former diplomats, experts in this area, and I think it's very likely, is that what I think you can expect with Harris is kind of a continuation of the policies of President Biden. A very, if Trump is hardline, I think with Harris, you would have a more comprehensive strategy, a more diplomatic strategy, a lot bigger emphasis on soft power, and working with governments to try to address these kind of issues. If we're going back to immigration, for example, looking at kind of root causes and how do you kind of boost those economies to try and prevent more people from coming in. On a number of other issues, I think you would find similarities that you would also with the Trump administration. Take China, for example. China is a huge issue for United States and Latin America. United States has, both parties have significant concerns about China influence in Latin America. And I think neither side wants to kind of open that door even more. And I think you're seeing more and more focus on those areas as well.
Let's build on that comment, and I agree with you in terms of how folks are looking at China from Washington perspective anyway. I think you could probably extrapolate that beyond China to, let's say, trade and investment issues. And it's been striking to me as I listen to both parties during this campaign season talk about trade as if it's a four-letter word or a dirty word. Of course, the Council of the Americas, our perspective is quite different. And we support trade expansion and we work for it and these sorts of issues. But the question I would have is, it sounds like you're suggesting that no matter who is elected president this year anyway, that trade policy might continue to be, I wouldn't say not a priority, but that we are going to look at trade in different ways, for example, not in the same strategic way as we traditionally did in the post-war years. Is that an accurate assessment? Or?
I think it's a fair assessment. I mean, I think we have seen that even in the Biden years. Biden, who's supportive of trade for many, many years. I think after the Trump administration and kind of like the Trump style of populism and nationalism, I think even Democrats in the Biden administration recognize that there has been a big concern about trade. Rightly or wrongly, that is where a lot of the American public is. Certainly working class Americans are concerned about U.S. factories, what have you. And I think you see that in the policies that, obviously that Trump is pushing for, but also some of the policies that Biden is. And I'm losing track of some of the slogans that Biden had, but some of them were very similar to the ones that Trump had. That said, I think in looking forward, perhaps in not a second administration, it would be a first administration for Harris as well. I think you might see more opportunities with trade. You're likely to see more opportunities with trade in a Harris administration. I think it's more expected, more traditional. Obviously, the Biden administration has been more engaging with the international community. Trump, for sure, he has resisted a lot of those issues. If he goes for trade, I imagine it would be kind of tied with other issues. I was talking with a high-ranking diplomat in Latin America who talks about how he would kind of group these issues. In the Biden administration, if you're talking about economics, you're talking about it's in the economics bucket. It's in the trade bucket. Trump puts it all together and wants one thing for the other. I mean, we have spoken in the past about CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. There is an issue that some Republicans really want to take a look at, particularly pushing out Nicaragua, for example. I do think that is an area that could be an issue, but especially for Trump, politically, he is very concerned about working class Americans again. And I think he's going to be very reluctant to do anything that could be perceived by working class Americans in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, to give them the idea that maybe they could be losing jobs. Now, if he is elected, maybe things change. That often happens with politicians.
But you look at the vice presidential choice that he made, and you read the
Great
book,
point.
Hillbilly Elegy, which I have. And it's a very good book. It's very well
bestseller.
And for a reason. But it takes a different view on trade and jobs, the international community, and sorts of things. And I guess my point in raising it is this will be an issue now, and it's really important because in 2026 we have what's intended to be a review of USMCA, the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement. So whoever is president will, by definition, be dealing with this review that was built into the original USMCA 6-year review from 2020. You'll also have a new president in Mexico. You'll also have a new prime minister in Canada. So it's going to be everybody will be new on the scene, perhaps. But the point that I'm making is trade is going to come up whether they want it to or not. And so it's going to be fundamentally and important to know how they're going to try to deal with these issues. They're really tough.
I mean, I think you can look back at the renegotiation in NAFTA. I mean, and how difficult that was, and the challenging and the emotions and the fights that came over on it. I mean, certainly, the issues that they're talking about in renegotiating USMCA are going to be, the certain. I know Canada has some issues about certain products that could be used. I will say, and when I was talking earlier to Republican strategists about some of these issues, he did say that Trump did not end the USMCA.
Right.
Pardon me, NAFTA.
Right.
He renegotiated it, unlike the Transatlantic Partnership Alliance, which he threw away. So his point was trade is not off the table.
Well, I think that's the optimistic view because, frankly, USMCA was a Trump administration initiative. It was bipartisan. It is bipartisan. And from our perspective, we don't think you need a renegotiation of it. We think you need a review and say, congratulations to all of us. We did a nice job. Let's move forward. and that's something that I think we'll have to see going forward.
Well, I also think you'll have, you're going to have a lot of, attention on that. I mean, you have some governments like, the Argentinian president, Javier Milei, Uruguay, Ecuador, there's a lot of interest from around the region to get tied into the USMCA. Trump, of course, is someone who likes bilateral relationships. He may be reluctant to do that, but I think there is an avenue to do some of this for some of these governments, but it may be through immigration in some fashion.
Yeah. Well, that's really the way to expand the hemispheric economic agenda, for sure, is giving access to USMCA. That's a whole separate democracy dialogues. Let's come back and talk to that one, because that is something that, frankly, Council of the Americas has been actively supporting. I think it makes a whole lot of sense, and it's the way forward from a strategic perspective. But this being democracy dialogues, let's turn the focus back to democracy. How do you sense that either a re-elected President Trump or a newly elected President Harris might deal with democracy issues in the hemisphere? You've already raised Nicaragua, which has now gone from democracy, troubled, yes, but democracy to dictatorship. We have the dictatorship, for 25 years in Venezuela. Cuba's always an issue. There are other countries that are also having challenges here, not to say we're not a perfect democracy either in the United States. So how do you address some of these issues? Do you have any predictions you'd like to offer to us along those lines? I mean, not to say that this is the most fair question you've ever gotten, but these are fundamental issues.
These are absolutely fundamental issues. I think you could anticipate that there are some governments who would be excited for Trump to come back. And I think there are other governments who are very, very concerned about Trump coming back. You mentioned Nicaragua and other governments. You have El Salvador and Bukele, who has definitely had some issues with human rights, democracy issues that the U.S. government has been putting pressure on. I think with the Trump administration, you're likely, or he is likely, and his government is likely, to get a little bit more of a hands-off approach. Venezuela and the democracy issue is such a wild card, in my opinion. You know this area better than I, but it's certainly the politics of Venezuela, the last experience with Venezuela, I think kind of will color what a potential future Trump administration would do. In the first administration, it was very much a maximum pressure campaign against it, hoping to kind of create or trigger a new government. That didn't happen. Will a second Trump administration try something like that again? When I talk to people, I think the question is they're not so sure. Does he want to go down that road again? Also, the Florida political situation is not the same. The politics of Florida and the wanting for a stronger policy, he doesn't need Florida so much. It's almost in the bag. That said, if he brings in Marco Rubio in a high-ranking position in the in the administration, Rubio is going to, this is an issue that is very close to Rubio's heart. I think there would be some interest there. But the hands-off approach that Trump has so often, I do wonder what would happen.
I think it's a really good point, though. I mean, this is not happening in a vacuum, right?
Absolutely.
A re-elected Donald Trump has some experience with Venezuela from a first term, and I think that's a really important point you made, and I think that's worth watching. Franco, we only have a couple minutes left in our session, but I do want to raise one more question, which has come up indirectly. I want to raise it directly because from the perspective of U.S. relations with Latin America, you have to deal with it because it's really a domestic issue for the United States, even though it's a sovereign foreign country, and that's Mexico.
Of course.
You'll have a new president in Mexico, the first woman president in Mexican history. You'll have the United States-Mexican relationship is always complicated, even when it's working really well. And I just wonder if you would have any insights as to how either a Donald Trump or a Kamala Harris might view the relationship with Mexico. We've talked about USMCA a little bit, but I'm talking about in the broader, fentanyl, security, borders. This is a big issue, no?
It is a huge issue, and I think in a Harris administration, I think the policies would be very much carried along of what Biden is doing. From all the high-ranking officials on both sides of the the border that I've spoken to, the relationship works pretty well. I was referring to how the Biden administration keeps their discussions, diplomacy in the proper buckets. There's no mixing of issues. And there's concern about Trump coming back and mixing some of those issues.
And linkages between trade,
correct.
Migration, energy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For Trump, if Trump were to get a second administration, I think it could be volatile. I think the language being used now, the threats, perhaps you could say, are being they're definitely being heard in Mexico. I mean, Mexico and U.S. have a long history. There has been an invasion of Mexico by the U.S. and that has been mentioned to me. So I mean, that's just one issue.
Yeah.
So I think there's no question that Trump is going to put a lot of pressure. A second administration, Trump would put a lot of pressure on Mexico. Yeah. At the same time, I think they are smart enough to know that they have to be careful to not go too far and not damage the relationship too much because of all the needs that the U.S. has on Mexico. I don't have to tell the group, economic relationship, most important partner, trading partner in the region, one of the most important in the world. Narcotics, narcotics work together, security, migration. The relationship is so important. But also there's China, which is a massive issue. The United States is very concerned about China's growing influence in the region. And I think the Trump administration is very focused on China internationally. And I think they want to be very careful not to create an even bigger opening in the region for China to walk in the door.
Well, in particular in Mexico, which traditionally has had a different relationship with China than some of the countries of South America, for example, because they're commodities exporters, whereas Mexico's more of manufacturing. And so that's a different relationship, and I would absolutely concur with what you're saying, is that will be something that folks will be watching to see what happens in terms of China's relationship with Mexico under a Sheinbaum administration, particularly as we do things like begin to look at USMCA again and rules of origin for autos. So all of these things are linked in together. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope that you will come back to Democracy Dialogues, perhaps after the U.S. elections or after the inauguration. Then we have the shape of the Congress and we know what's going on there. But
I would love to, Eric.
Thank you for your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank all of you for joining us at Democracy Dialogues. It's a conversation that we've been having now for some time. If you want to look at some previous episodes, all you have to do is go to YouTube and dial it up, or you can go to our website, which is www.as-coa.org. And until then, please help us work together to ensure that democracy delivers for all of us.